about that 80, what I'm not talking about is down here.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about jump miles. I'm talking about solid quality endurance, maybe with a little bit of low tempo stuff.
Sure. So the intensity factor of 0.8.
For you, with a 250 threshold, I'm talking about going out for a 3-hour ride and just sitting on 170 watts.
Sure.
Now, you do that for 3 hours, you're going to want a litre of chocolate milk or something at least when you get in. It's going to, it's going to tire you somewhat. So it's quality, that 80. It's just that, it's that upper tempo, low threshold stuff. You're going to stay away from.
Avoid it. Okay. That's a no man's land.
Yeah, you can come to it. Like I said, you can come to it when you start to get race specific.
Right. We can grow
for your key races.
Right.
But for your road races, for your kind of people there, that's when you're getting into the realms of any individuals. You have to say to them, right, well, if you're always going to race at the weekend, that's your quality. So during the week, we just have to, we just have to not do quality, because otherwise you end up being tired 10.
So we got to use tired 10 on the blog post. We have plenty of tired 10s. We're trying to work that out.
So for triathlon and time trials, you're pretty much saying start by working both ends and then bring it together.
Exactly. So, the best games that I've seen hands-on with, my pro athletes is where, as an example, we spent the winter period doing basically a solid lot of endurance work and with low tempo, and there's a reason that you do tempo work with endurance work. I'll come on to either tomorrow or later today. In conjunction with very short, high-intensity intervals, maybe even sort of W prime related intervals, like 10-second sprint, 50-second recovery type stuff. And then, as we got nearer early season A races, that's when we then started introducing very specific blocks of race intensity work. And not complicated, but you start out giving, say for an Olympic distance triathlete, you start out giving them, let's say, 5 by 8 minutes at that race specific goal intensity, which is probably likely going to sit, low to middle threshold zone, and then that 5 by 8 becomes 4 by 10, becomes 3 by 12, becomes 2 by 15, becomes 2 by 17, becomes 2 by 20, becomes 1 by 30, becomes 1 by 40. That's your 8-week lead-in done. And this is where kind of the art of coaching comes in. You can understand the science, but that kind of progressive stuff is all the art stuff, which which you guys got, just experience, just apply some kind of common sense and experience to it. So, in terms of these training zones, what do we actually see going on in the body? And this is what I was saying about this kind of grey zone, this sort of grey area. Things aren't kind of clearly delineated that in this zone this is happening, in this zone that's happening. Because what you can see here is that these things are basically starred, like about 5 stars is
They're prescriptions.
Well, 5 stars is really, really good, and 1 star is not very good at all. So, if you're doing endurance work, you'll get plenty of adaptation in terms of increased blood volume. So that's an interesting one to touch on as well. So increased blood volume, so plasma volume increases. This is why you have a situation where somewhat unscrupulous age group athletes manage to microdose EPO, because what they do lots of endurance exercise, plasma volume goes up, hematocrit count goes down. Go and see your 75-year-old village doctor and tell him, I'm really tired all the time. I don't know what's wrong, I've got no energy. I can't do anything really, and I sit at work, I can't concentrate. And he goes, oh, you're anemic. We'll give you some EPO. That happens a lot.
So does Viagra. You can abuse Viagra pretty easily.
That might be a bit uncomfortable to race with, though.
Yeah. It's a big vasodilator, it has nothing to do with the other
Yeah,
stuff. Thank you, sorry.
Rich, shut up.
Yeah.
You have to have a saddle specific.
Yeah.
That's a whole other bike for
Two numbers.
Craig.
What you also see with
I'll
endurance
put that
work
as
is
a
you see.
question.
You take Viagra. 9G.
What you also see is sort of moderate increased capillarization, but very little neuromuscular adaptation. So this is a really useful one as a reference, and like I said, I'll send the slides through because it gives you an idea of what's going on. So it's not until, for instance, where you get up to really hard efforts that you'll see stimulation of sort of aerobic enzymes, improved use of lactate as a fuel, rate of glycogen usage, improved neuromuscular adaptation, very high intensity. So there's definite crossover in terms of what you see with the training. So that was a whole stuff on physiology, and just to finish it off, I wanted to touch on female athletes because I did bring up the subject of anatomical and sort of gender differences. Before I do that though, any questions on any of the physiology stuff? Because I've kind of almost brain dumped to first year undergraduate of stuff on you guys. I stole this from one of Rich's friends, Stacey Sims. Women are not little men, physiologically speaking. Totally true. There's a couple of things to really understand that differentiate working with them. Fairly obvious things are morphology, muscle mass, physical size, and cardiac mass as well. And this is an interesting one because I was having a discussion with a physical therapist who was also an elite athlete around this whole, we were just chatting about training stuff, and we got to the subject of this 220 minus your age as a maximum heart rate. And we were chatting about it, and I said, it's strange because I've never come across anybody that pretty much fits that mathematical model, and I know why, because the study that they did that was in about 1920, and they basically took a whole spectrum of people from the age of sort of 16 to 70, and it was about 60 subjects, and that was it. But the point that she made was, well, it's fairly obvious why all of the individuals that you particularly had, because I gave her some examples, and they were all females. So, I said, what was the females that have ridiculously high heart rates? She's like, well, we've got a smaller heart. But it's true, there is a female athlete does have a slightly smaller heart. So as a consequence, if you want the same stroke volume, then you're going to have to beat faster. So that might be why sometimes when you have female athletes come in and they're looking at their heart rate and they're chatting away, and yet it seems disproportionately high. It might not. It just might be that they rev high.
Two of my teammates, one of them has a max heart rate probably in the 160s. And I'll do a 40K time trial at 179,
Yeah.
180. And I've got another teammate who will just be cruising around talking. He's in the mid 190s. And yeah.
What, similar age?
About all of us within a year of each other.
Right. Okay.
And
that's cardiac mass, that's a stroke volume.
and Jason does have a larger left ventricle.
Yeah. The other thing to understand is that for a female athlete, with the menstrual cycle and the different phases, follicular and luteal phases, that there are clear differences in both in terms of glycogen metabolism and training adaptation. And then obviously you have the female athlete triad, which I just touched on. So in terms of muscle mass, things to bear in mind is that obviously with less muscle mass, there's less heat production. So a good example of this is, and that actually also comes down to play in the surface area as well, in terms of heat dissipation. A couple of years ago in Ironman China, it was like 100% humidity and about 100 degrees. And literally, all but a couple of the pro athletes were walking the run. Even the lead male pro walked the last 5K virtually. The fastest run was by the winning female pro, who happened to be 5'2" and about 110 pounds wet. There's a reason for that. Less heat generated, less heat to dissipate. Surface areas. It's why, for instance, in the woodlands, there were an awfully large amount of big individuals getting killed last Saturday, in a proper mess on the run. Personally, I saw in the first 6 miles, and this is kind of the sharp end guys, guys getting off the bike in sub 5 hours. There was already one guy collapsed with heat stroke at mile 6. There were athletes who, finish line, were convinced of having heat stroke on the bike, and in fact, I think Steve, you said it was like 103 on the heat index midway through the bike last Saturday in the race.
There's a big percentage that never finished that race. It was like over 400.
17.5% didn't finish that race.
When I raced track, I was a kid in the 80s. I was living in Colorado Springs, but Texas was home. I had to come back here for district championships to go to nationals. It was in Albuquerque and Houston. And I had been training in Colorado Springs. And I went down there and died. I was winning in Colorado against, well-trained Olympic well-trained athletes. And I go to Houston and got my ass kicked. I couldn't finish. And it was all heat.
Yeah, it's all heat and humidity because, come back to this thing about surface area, heat dissipation, heat generation. So, those two are interrelated with blood flow. Blood flow is dictated by cardiac. So, that's why a lot of athletes that race with, I know I've spoken with a lot of athletes that race last weekend with power and heart rate and all that kind of stuff. And they're all saying that, I was riding at similar heart rates, even accounting for cardiac drift. I was riding at similar heart rates to how I was training 2-3 weeks ago. The power was a lot lower. Or, I was riding at, not quite goal power, slightly below it, but my heart rate was like sky high. It's like, well, of course it's sky high because, you're generating a lot of heat and you're working bloody hard to try and get rid of that heat, and you can't because, it's just not doable when you've got, once, was it 30 something? It's like 38 degrees, maybe 40. Once it goes over 40, I'm sorry, I'm talking the sea. It's like 100, principally like about 100. Once it goes over 100 from a heat index point of view, the body can't maintain homeostasis. So then it becomes an interplay of size and surface area. And some people deal with it better, especially if they're acclimated. Also in terms of force production, obviously with less muscle mass, there's less capacity to produce force, but there's still may be an entirely equal power to weight ratio basis. And obviously being potentially a smaller athlete, they may have a smaller surface area, so aerodynamically they can potentially be in a more advantageous position. But the mechanical work and proportional to cadence is a point that I bring up particularly because this whole thing about lower cadence and running at a lower cadence. And cadence and power are incredibly interrelated. And they're interrelated principally to do with muscle contraction capacity. And obviously, if a female athlete has less muscle mass, then it may be that the contractile velocity of her muscle mass, what it prefers, and stop me if this is not making sense because I will talk about it when I talk about strength training, will mean that actually she prefers to ride at 65 to 75 RPM. And this is why actually what you see with Brett Sutton is with all the girls that he works with, they all ride at low, they all ride mid to low 70s. All the Ironman athletes. It's because what Brett understands is that actually it's more appropriate for them to be riding at that lower power output. A, because they're producing less power, even though they might be producing way more than most age group men do on a watt per kilo basis. But in terms of the actual power they're producing, it's a lot less.
I always thought we were trying to go for a higher rev per watt ratio, but I guess not.
Yes, you're on to, yeah. You're trying to adjust it slightly as a developmental tool.
Would you train, like if you had a pure time trialist, you had a
Yes.
triathlete, would you want them, like the triathlete, to have a higher preferred cadence because they ride afterwards?
No. No. So this thing about cycling cadence matching running cadence, that's a myth that I have no idea where that came from, but
I
it's
was
certainly
thinking more
based on science.
Not fatiguing the muscles so much for
No, because the body, the body will choose a cadence that suits it most appropriately. I will explain that in more tomorrow when I talk about the strength training. But the body has a natural tendency to favour a cadence that is driven by, Rich uses this phrase, kind of watts per pedal revolution. We all have a preferential rate. It's dictated by our muscle mass, our muscle fibre typing, and we'll just revert to that, plus or minus a bit, all the time. And so, no, I wouldn't see a reason to say you should ride at a high cadence. Now, it's not to say that if somebody rides an unduly low cadence, they need to develop it, because I have got that situation with one pro who, rides at such a low cadence that most of the time they're overgeared on their bike, because they just, if they prefer to ride at 65 RPM all the time, and they get to a hill and they've got a 39.23 on the back, they're screwed. Because they haven't got the engine to put out 350 watts at 125 pound female to get up the climb in that gear. So actually it then comes down to actually a mechanical issue with the bike. And kind of on that note, I would say that the majority, even around here with the flat, it's hillier here than it is down in the woodland. But the majority of triathletes don't need a 53-39. They can all ride 50-34. And if they're really desperate, they can put an 11 on the back. Because a 50-11 is a big gear.
That's right.
And the reality is that most are so overgeared that they're so overgeared they're not capable of producing the power to actually ride at their preferred cadence. So is anybody here ever dealt with a cyclist that says, I can't ride up hills? I can't do it. Even
We
though
get
they're
that all
reasonably
the
fit.
Yeah,
Personally,
we got
Yeah,
you.
personally, I grew up in Florida. When I moved to Memphis,
Yeah.
and it's just rolling hills. They're not steep, but they
Yeah.
quit for 20 miles. Yeah, guess who was the caboose on most of their rides for 6 months? I didn't know how to gear, I didn't know how to pedal, and I just was not trained for it. I get down on the flats in 100-degree heat, 100% humidity. Great.
Yeah.
But in the group that had been out there, I could not ride hills for the longest time.
When she's fresh, she's a 170 watt professional ride, and you can see her size. She's perfect morphology for powered weight.
Yeah.
And we're riding 165s on a 50-34.
Yeah, I'm on a compact set, which I'm very happy with.
Yeah.
It works for me with my cadence.
So maybe that's something we should think about with our athletes, the three of us. As Craig does the fits, he'll put them on my.
What are your thoughts on it? Do you think I'm talking out my rear end? Or?
No, so what I find from the perspective in bike fit is coming back to a rider selecting cadence. And I always ask the rider, what is your normal cadence? Because the first thing they do is they get on there and they think it's cool. And they're nailing out 110. And I know they're not going to ride 110. So I get them to come back down to something that's natural. But along that same component is how they're holding their foot. Because everybody tells them, oh, you need to be toe down. Oh, you need to be scraping metal. You got to do all the shit.
Yeah.
And the studies that I've looked at is the best position of the foot is the one that you naturally will gravitate to, unless you've been really low in the saddle where you had no choice but to drop it. It's just that bad, or too high.
Yeah.
If you're too high, you're going to toe down. But finding that, because I've got some riders, I can't get them to those normative ranges with their foot. I can't get them to go there.
That, yeah, I mean, that might be that maybe there's some functional issue in there in terms of they have, in that posterior chain, there's tightness somewhere. I'm not gonna say that it's there or here, but there's somewhere in that posterior chain there's tightness. It could even be all the way up that myofascial, if you get into that, this kind of myofascial train stuff, the myofascial slings and posterior. So that posterior chain runs all the way up and then diagonally across. It could be up, so it could be upper cross syndrome that's running all the way back down. But with that, I'm sure you've seen the paper where they say, what's all this stuff about how you pedal. It's like just push harder. They did that study where they looked at Olympic cyclists and they looked at like national standard Cat 1 roadies. They said, what's the difference? These guys push harder. Now, there's actually slightly more to it than that. It's just that these guys are actually also have more efficient muscle fibers. So if you look at EMG stuff as well between the novice and the elite, what you'll see is, for instance, in the gastro, they did some studies by Bonacci. I'll show it in a bit. They did some studies and what they found was that sort of the muscle fiber activity was massively more in the same muscle than it was in the novice for the same power production. So these guys were much more efficient in producing relevant power. So like I say, menstrual cycle impacts on substrate utilization, so glycogen, fats and free fatty acids. It affects plasma volume, and if it affects plasma volume, it affects heat tolerance, and if it affects heat tolerance, it affects performance. And you also see changes in lactate as a fuel and as a byproduct.
So that becomes part of the discussion.
Yeah, I think, as you know, me as a coach, I do have a discussion with my female athletes and say, when we're planning their A races, I will ask them. I say, whereabouts is this in your cycle? And I'll explain to them why. I don't think it's unreasonable. I'm not. I had that to and fro with one of my pros actually. I'm really friends with, and I said to them, are you offended by the fact that I'm asking you about your cycle? And she was like, no, not at all. It kind of makes sense.
From a bike fit perspective, I fit a lot of female riders. They don't want to be on a platform in front of everyone in a bike shop discussing different things.
Yeah.
And that's why the one-on-one tends to work and we have good results. But yeah, there's other, and I haven't figured out a way to approach that. Other anatomical.
So there's actual sort of functional movement factors as well.
Not in that, but anatomical differences.
Okay.
So, and it actually makes a significant difference in seat selection.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, when you say, you ask, are you offended by this? And what I need to know even goes further, and I don't know how to approach that.
I think
I
don't know. I mean, I don't know Texas women very well. So.
Try to come back in 2 weeks.
But as an aside, Craig, since we're on this topic and we're all professionals here, I don't know about other ladies, but I'm almost debilitated sometimes by cramps. I stink of pharmaceutical painkillers by day 2, and it does affect my performance. I know not to go out in the heat because my sweating capability is on/off.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah, and I'll just stay indoors on that day, just sweat the ibuprofen on it.
So going to that, from a male coach perspective, because you know, some female riders just want to work with females coaches and vice versa. And there's all of that. How would you feel being, you know, from a male coach asking you about those things?
Well, I wasn't raised right. I have no compunction about talking about bodily functions. Some of you already noticed.
I think it's
that.
you put it to
Just
them
isn't
professionally. I mean, I think one way of
Yeah.
approaching it is I had recently I had one female athlete say to me that they were like, I can't. They just started doing triathlon. It wasn't one of my athletes. It was just in a conversation. And they said, "Yeah, you know, I don't know how you manage this because you know, for starters, every single time I get off the bike, you know, and I go for a pee, it hurts. It's like burning fire." I'm like, I said, what the hell? I said, that's not what should be happening. You need to have a discussion. You need to go and have a discussion with somebody about a more appropriate saddle choice. And so that's maybe your way of positioning things. Say, look, you know, there are certain factors that relate to saddle choice that can have a significant impact. You know, a good example would be your ability to go to the toilet afterwards, and it'll hurt a lot or it won't hurt at all. You know,
And I think with
kind of start to come at it
triathletes,
from that angle, and then you might be okay.
I think with triathletes and the level of athlete you're working with, if you approach it that way and say, you know, I need to ask you a few questions, let me know if you're comfortable with this, you're going to get, you know, people like us that will just tell you whatever because we want to be a better athlete, and then you may get the newer athletes that are like, yeah, you know, let's just
Or
go with what we have
women
right
that
now.
were raised to be modest, ladies raised in a Muslim tradition would not be comfortable discussing this
I
topic.
probably wouldn't even have a bike fit with you.
Yeah, or they probably wouldn't even have a
Yeah.
bike fit with you if
Yeah.
they're traditional. But just approach it professionally and give them the option to not answer those questions to you, but then offer a solution of, come talk to me, come talk to somebody else. And, you know, hey, I live with the plumbing, I kind of get it. Whereas they might not have ever had those discussions even amongst family with their doctor. So,
I have similar issues with male riders too, because they don't want to talk about it.
talk about it.
They're junk.
They don't want to say, yeah, I'm numb for 2 hours after.
Right.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. As a
Oh,
fitter, that's the most important information he needs to know. They don't want to share that.
Yeah.
So.
But also with you know with novice athletes, it's also you know novice athletes coming from the studio. I don't know how you guys, Tracy, Justine, Rich, how you position this, but also just simple things like you know wearing underwear. You know,
Oh yeah.
I had one guy about 6 years ago, about 6 or 7 years ago. He's a good friend of mine now. When he first started doing cycling, after about 3 weeks, I wasn't coaching him at this point, but he was a good friend, and he said to me, after about 3 weeks of going out on the club ride on a Saturday, you know, and where we lived, it was serious lads on Saturday ride, and he said to me, he said, I don't know how you do it. He said, oh, man, he said, downstairs, I am like shredded to pieces. And I went, Ben, what do you mean? And he went, I said, listen, I'm in bits, I'm like bleeding. I went, what do you mean you're bleeding? And he goes, oh, it's my boxer shorts, they're rubbing. I went, what? And he's like, well, don't you wear your boxer shorts on your cycling shorts? I was like, no. You know, and sometimes it's the people that don't even realise that, you know. I know ladies, and I do know that a lot of ladies will sometimes, again, coming back to this,
They'll work
sometimes will generally, I know this is being in detail, but sometimes will generally prefer to wear underwear during the run, and that has implications in terms of bike fit or comfort. So.
Real quickly, one of the things Stacy Sims does is she tells her athletes, you know what, send me a text with 1 asterisk if you're having a normal flow, 2 asterisks for heavy flow, 3 asterisks for pain, and you know what, we'll change your schedule, bring you down to something that's more tempo-ish or LSD-ish. But she said the best 5 days for training are the premenstrual days because your hormone release is so much stronger, and you get a physiological return.
Do you want me to? Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry, my bad.
So 6 to 9 days after in the follicular phase, you'll see the glucose kinetics are a lot faster. So transportation and availability of the glucose is reduced. It's not increased, it's reduced because the kinetics are faster. So it kind of goes through. The percentage of CHO, so the percentage of carbs used is greater due to the fact that there's reduced lipid oxidation, so there's reduced use of fats. So there's more free fatty acids in circulation, and the adaptation to training is lower than in the luteal phase due to hormones, progesterone, and estrogen levels. There's greater fluid retention, heat tolerance is an issue, performance is reduced. And then, so 19 to 22 days after is where you see carbohydrate consumption is actually really, really important from a performance point of view. And actually this is where potentially with female athletes, actually there is the possibility that this is a marginal gain thing, that they start to periodise their nutrition. So they don't change the calories necessarily, but they change where they're getting them from. Plasma volume is reduced, so there's a greater risk of hyponatremia. Heat tolerance is elevated core temperature, although sweat rates remain unchanged. Performance is markedly better